finished up lesson 1 last week and then jumped right into lesson 2. And we saw his continued plan for Israel. And it's important for us to be reminded of where Israel's at right now as a nation. Of course, they're in Egypt. They are being in heavy bondage and slavery, working themselves to death every day for Pharaoh, and to increase the kingdom of Pharaoh, the kingdom of Egypt. And then it gets to the point here at the end of chapter 2 that these Israelites pretty much just can't take it anymore, right? And they cry out to God, and we specifically took some time last week talking about the transcendence of God, as how it's important for us to remember that while God is above us, above the earth, and not constrained by our limits and not constrained by what we can consider the physical environment around us. He is involved in the affairs of humans and his people, and that he knows exactly what's going on. Of course, all part of his plan, but there was an important moment in the fact that they actually heard their cry and made the decision to do something about it. Because of this, he expresses his love for Israel, and of course the covenant that was given to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And that brought us to the continued preparation of Moses. Now, when we left Moses, he has now fled Egypt because he has killed an Egyptian who was probably beaten on a couple of Hebrews a little too hard, and was worried for them, and tried to bury him and cover him up. Pharaoh catches word what he's done, so he's hightailed it out of town in the desert, and that's where he spends 40 years. And God is continuing here to prepare Moses to go back to Egypt to lead his people out of there. Okay? And we finished up last week down through verse 4 when God comes down to Moses. Again, we see God's transcendent help here, which is kind of the overarching theme through this entire lesson, is that he shows up, he comes down, and he's in the burning bush. And Moses is there tending some sheep that he's been doing now for quite some time. And at first he sees the burning bush, and he's kind of looking at it and not really sure exactly what's going on. And it takes God actually speaking out to him, saying, "Moses, Moses," and Moses responding by saying, "Here I am." So we see him coming down here to speak to Moses to further prepare him to be the guy that leads the people out of Egypt. Now, when you think about Moses here, for the first 40 or so years of his life, lived life of luxury there in Egypt, learned from the best people in the world at the time. Egypt would have been the greatest nation in the world, the greatest kingdom at the time, had the most advanced technologies and all that kind of stuff. So he was learning all of that, learning how to be essentially a pharaoh, a leader of people, a leader of men. And then God allowed him to be there and kept him there for that reason. Then moved him into the wilderness to, I wouldn't say humble him, but that's what happened. But continued to teach him. In Egypt, he learned head knowledge and head lessons, and now God's teaching heart lessons. Is essentially what's going on here, preparing him to be the guy that leads his people out. Okay, so that brings us to, we see where he was at there, Mount Sinai. Pretty good piece away from Egypt. This is where Mount Hor, the same thing as Mount Sinai, right there on the map. That's where he's at right now. That's where God shows up to him at the burning bush. Okay, that brings us to where we finished up, where we need to start today there in verse 5 down through verse 9. Now, this is again God's continued preparation of Moses. He comes down to him first and kind of reveals himself, and then now he gives Moses some commands. And some of the things that he wants Moses to do. Go to verse 5 there, chapter 3, and let's read through page 2, verse 9. And he said, "Draw not nigh hither, put off thy shoes from off thy feet, for the place whereon thou standest is holy ground. Moreover, he said, I am the God of thy father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look upon God. And the Lord said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people which are in Egypt, and have heard their cry by reason of their taskmasters, for I know their sorrows. And I am come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians, and to bring them up out of that land unto a good land, and a large, unto a land flowing with milk and honey, and to the place of the Canaanites, and the Hittites, and the Amorites, and the Perizzites, and the Hivites, and the Jebusites. Now therefore, behold, the cry of the children of Israel is come unto me, and I have also seen the oppression wherewith the Egyptians oppress them. Alright, so God, verse 5, warns Moses, first of all, right, not to draw near to the bush, not to get any closer, right? And he says, verse 5, and he said, not draw, not nigh hither. He also instructs Moses to take his shoes off. Now, why does God not want Moses to get any closer to the bush? This happens a couple times with Moses throughout his life. Why does God not want Moses to get closer to the bush? We'll talk about the shoes in a second. Why can he not get any closer?
Sinful man.
Sinful man cannot be close to perfect God. Right? Be in the presence of him, but he can't get any closer to him. Now, we know fire is a pretty mesmerizing thing, right? It's pretty easy to just kind of stare and look at a fire, especially on a nice cold day, or the fire's cracking on the popping, or you burn a big bonfire, burn a bunch of boxes, or whatever. Fire can be pretty mesmerizing. It can be pretty captivating, and pretty easy to kind of walk kind of just up to, right? So God is telling Moses here, don't come any closer for your own safety, but most importantly because you can't get any closer to the presence of God. This is a sinful thing. And we see that by him, the second commandment is what? Take those shoes off, right? You are in holy territory. Take your shoes off because you are in holy territory. This is holy ground that you are. This is a physical illustration of the transcendence of God. God's coming down. He had to come down, but he's not on man's level, right? There's not an equalness between God and Moses. He had to come down and speak to him, but that does not mean that they are the same. Okay? His holiness separates him from man. That's why Moses couldn't get any closer and why he had to take his shoes off. Okay? Because of who God is, because of his character, of what makes God up. Moses and him are separated, and Moses could not get any closer. All right, then we get to verse 6, and this bush continues to talk to Moses, right? And it says, and God introduces himself. Okay? Now, would Moses have been aware before this of God in his life? Yes, right? How come? Exactly, because we know that he spent time under the tutelage of his mother and father when he was a young child. And they should have obviously taught him about God, okay, about God. So Moses would have been aware. Now, we have not seen as of yet God directly intervening in Moses' life. Okay? This is the first instance of this actually taking place. And it happens a couple times to Moses, a lot of times. This is the actually first time. So God introduces himself to Moses as God the Father, God of Abraham, of Isaac, and of Jacob. Okay? Not that Moses probably didn't know that, but God is, again, expressing the importance of the reverence that Moses should be showing him, and also a reminder to Moses of a little bit of foreshadowing here of what Moses is getting ready to do, right? Because Israelites hear the name Abraham, they think of the covenant, and they understand that God's promised to them. Okay? And we see the response of Moses at the end of verse 6, right? So after God tells him, introduces himself, I'm the God of thy father, the God of Abraham, of Isaac, the God of Jacob. What did Moses do? Why? Scared, right? He's afraid to look upon the manifestation of God before him. So the response here of Moses and the fact that God's presence there, what did God's presence help Moses to understand about himself and about God? We see it evident here in Moses' response. What does Moses reveal about himself and about God? Exactly, right? Moses is reminded of his sinfulness, his unholiness, and God's perfectness. Okay? And absolute holiness of God. That's why we see him hiding his face here. Moses hiding his face is an appropriate response from Moses in the presence of God. He understands here the transcendence of God and sensed the unworthiness of himself to be in his presence. Now, he's more than willing to honor God's command here by not getting close to the bush. He's more than willing to do that. Now, verse 7, we see God beginning to give Moses the explanation to why he's here in this bush and why he's speaking to Moses. Explains to him exactly why he has picked Moses and why he's talking to him. All right, verse 7, the Lord said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people, which are in Egypt, and have heard their cries by reason of their taskmasters, for I know their sorrows. I am come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians, and to bring them up out of that land, unto a good land, and a large, unto a land flowing with milk and honey, to the place of the Canaanites, and the Hittites, and the Amorites, and the Perizzites, and the Hivites, and the Jebusites. Now therefore, behold, the cry of the children of Israel is come unto me, and I have seen the oppression wherewith the Egyptians oppress them. So God then explains why he had come down, because he heard the cry of Israel. And again, he communicates that he heard his people, and he understands and is sensitive to their sorrows. Okay? And the plan here is to deliver them out of Egypt into a land that's what? Flowing with milk and honey. Okay? A land that's flowing with milk and honey. So the scene here includes God demanding Moses to stay back while communicating to him the reason that he came down. And that was, of course, because he cared about his people and wanted to deliver them. Right? The dichotomy here, both God's transcendence and his immanence continues as God is going to instruct and give Moses a commission here as we kind of get in to the next part of this. Okay? So God, he's commanding separation from Moses because of his holiness and Moses' unholiness. Now, after God explains to him, hey Moses, I'm here in this bush for this reason, he goes on and gives him a commission. And we see that starting in verse 10. And he starts by assuring Moses of his presence. So God's now giving him his initial introductions and his reasons for appearing. Now is going to reveal why he's talking to Moses and not one of the other Israelites. Verse 10 of chapter 3. Come thou therefore, and I will send thee unto Pharaoh, that thou mayest bring forth my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. So God tells Moses, and let's just kind of imagine this. Moses is shying away from the presence of the bush. His face is hidden, and he hears God's plan. He's going to deliver the people, and Moses is probably thinking, that's good, it's a great idea that they need to be delivered. And then God says, I'm going to use you. And you probably kind of see Moses not look, that head kind of snap up a little bit. What? What did you just say? Me. What are you talking about? Verse 11, and we see kind of some of that reaction, right? And Moses said to God, who am I that I should go unto Pharaoh, and that I should bring forth the children of Israel out of Egypt? So we see Moses' reaction, and we see him ask the question, and why do we think that Moses had this reaction to God? What's some of the reasons behind Moses' answer? Who am I to do something like that? Anybody have a reason why Moses might act like that?
Number one, the timing seems weird, because there was a time earlier when he had some position in Egypt.
Absolutely.
But now he had to run because he's in trouble.
Absolutely.
So why now?
Absolutely.
Why not when I had some...
Clout and some ability to do this. Absolutely. That's a great, probably first initial thought. Why didn't he do this 40 years ago? Why didn't he do this? Why not 40 years ago? Why not move? I already said he had to run, leave, flee Egypt because he had killed him. Right? The Pharaoh at that time wanted to kill him. The Israelites, if you remember, not long after he killed him, the Israelites saw him, some of theirs, in the kill us too, which he did. They rejected his leadership essentially at that point. They had voiced their suspicions about his character back over in chapter 2. And I'm sure as Moses is standing there, all of that stuff just comes pouring back into his mind. Right? All of those instances and all those experiences and all those memories come flying back into his mind. And so it's no wonder here Moses is resistant to this plan that God is revealing to him, to send him back to Pharaoh, to have him talk to Pharaoh and to lead his people out. Now we get to verse 12. And as we read verse 12, let's think about what should have given Moses confidence. Why his response should have been different. Verse 12. And he said, this is God speaking, what? Certainly, I will be with thee. And this shall be a token unto thee that I have sent thee. When thou hast brought forth the people out of Egypt, ye shall serve God upon this mountain. Okay? So what should have instantly given Moses confidence? God says, when Moses says, whoa, this is not for me. I'm not the guy. Maybe at one point in my life would have worked, probably not. Been a better chance than it is now, but I'm not the dude for this. You got the wrong person. What should have flipped Moses' reservations here? When God said what? What did God say?
Worship thee on this mountain.
Yes, but before that though, what did he say? Hey, I know you're scared. I know you don't think it's right, but I will be with you. Moses should have been, all right, hey, let's go right now. You need to go right now, we got it. As we know that this God that Moses has learned about and knows about has already done some pretty impressive things for these Israelites and for the world. And we can imagine, we can go back through what we just studied in Genesis. Moses would have known these things too. And it should have instantly changed his idea. And we also see a little more foreshadowing here on behalf of God, right? It comes back and says, if you do this, I'm going to bring you forth. You're going to serve God up on this mountain. Which would be in God just giving Moses some more ammunition to kind of help prod him into accepting this task that he's giving. Now there's a contrast here. And let's not miss this contrast between previously here in verse 6 of God demanding Moses not to come any closer, right? And then God's assurance that God would be with Moses while he's talking to Pharaoh. Okay? God wanted Moses to understand that both his transcendence and his imminence as he's commissioning Moses. Moses is going to learn more about what it meant here for God to actually be with him. As God reveals to him more about the transcendence of his nature. Okay? So he's told Moses what he wants, reassured him that he would be with him for all of this as well during his. Then we get to verse 13 and he reveals more here of his transcendence. Okay? Verse 13, first of all. Moses then responds. And Moses said unto God, Behold, when I come unto the children of Israel, and shall say unto them, The God of your father hath sent me unto you, and they shall say to me, What is his name? What shall I say unto them? Okay? Moses wants here to know more about God. He says, all right, so if I do this, if I decide to go back into Egypt, and I get into amongst the Israelites, and I tell him this plan, and say that the God of your fathers sent me, how am I going to talk to them? How are they going to respond? What can I say to them to get them to believe that I'm here to help them leave Egypt? Okay? Moses here is wanting to know more about God. If God was really going to go with him, what could he count on God to do? That's what's going on here. All right, if I do this, how are you going to help me? Right? How are you going to actually be with me? How are you going to make sure that these people believe me? First of all, they don't just hunt me down and beat me to death or laugh me off or whatever. How are you going to help? Now, Moses doesn't come right out and ask God what he's like. But he does suggest that God's people in Israel are going to want to know what God is like, right? And why he's here now. In verse 13, at the end of it, what is his name? What shall I say unto him? Now, most likely, when he shows up into Egypt there, the people would, in fact, ask Moses about God's identity. Okay? Moses would need to know how to identify God. Maybe Moses was hiding also maybe a lack of confidence here in God by removing the question from his lips, right, and placing it on to the Israelites. And he's saying, they're going to want to know about you. Well, I'll say, really Moses is saying, what do I need to know about you? How can you help me? In what way are you going to help me succeed at this task? Asking about God's name here it is the same thing as asking about God's character and about his ability. Right? Asking about God's name, what are they going to call you? It's the same thing as asking about his ability and what he's able to do and about his character. The question here was more probably for Moses to strengthen his confidence in God's ability to help him have the answer with the Israelites when he gets there. Moses' whole interaction here in chapter 3 with God is one that is fraught with personal doubts and with fears. But as God most of the time does here, it kind of goes along with Moses' question in verse 14. And gives him the context here that he can kind of talk to the Israelites. And he says, and God says unto Moses, what? In big capital letters in our Bibles, it says what? I am that I am. And he said, thus shalt thou say unto the children of Israel, I am hath sent me unto you. Now, the I am that I am, that means little to us, but in Hebrew, it was very, very clear to Moses. The name I am means God is self-sustaining. Okay? God is self-sustaining. Being self-sustaining means what? God is what? Is he dependent on other things or other people or other stuff? No, right? God's only dependent on what? Himself, right? God is only dependent. He is self-dependent. He never had a beginning. He's never going to have an end. He's outside of our time, our space. He's infinitely big and powerful. In other words, he is transcendent. Okay? God is indescribably above all of humanity. Now, looking back at verse 14, what would have been for Moses some of the implications here of God's transcendence? What would have been some of the implications? Look at verse 14. And God said unto Moses, I am that I am. And he said, thus shalt thou say to the children of Israel, I am hath sent me unto you. What would some of these implications for Moses be here? The I am is with him. The I am sent him. So what would that mean for Moses on Moses' behalf? Would Moses have anything to fear? No, right? Would Moses have any need to doubt or worry? Absolutely not. Would Moses have something or somebody to put his entire trust into? Yes, right? He could be assured that God would accomplish the plan just as he wanted it accomplished. Moses is mine, this is already done, I just have to go through whatever God wants me to do to get it finished. Verse 15, go to it, please. And God said moreover unto Moses, thus shalt thou say unto the children of Israel, the Lord God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and God of Jacob, hath sent me unto you. This is my name forever, and this is my memorial unto all generations. What does God reveal here about his longevity, about his name? I am is what? Forever, right? I am is forever. He will be the I am. He has always been the I am. He will forever be the I am. That never changes. It's who God is. And by telling the people that, it just kind of adds more reinforcement And the same thing for Moses. He's reinforcing Moses' confidence that God will be with him. Now, this God that showed up to Moses, is telling him this plan and wanting him to do this, lead the people out and explain to him that he is the I am. That is the exact same I am that's here today, right? It's the exact same God. It's still I am today. He is still far above us. Yet he has promised us that he is going to be with us in every moment of every day. Good days, bad days, hills and valleys, smooth seas and rough sailing. God has promised to always be with us. It's a privilege for us to know a transcendent God. Right? It's an absolute privilege for us to know this transcendent God. Now, let's move on to the next part of this. God's told him the plan, reinforced his confidence in him, and then now he's going to give him some instructions. Okay? You can imagine just rolling through Moses' mind right now. This is a guy that's just been just a good old boy for the last 4 years, just working and sit down and tending to the sheep and just doing his own thing. We can imagine what's just rolling through his mind right now as we get into verse 16. Because God's going to just jump right into it. He's revealed himself as introduction as the I am, and he's not wasting any time. He's going to jump right into the instructions that he has for Moses. Verse 16, Go and gather the elders of Israel together, and say unto them, The Lord God of your fathers, God of Abraham, of Isaac, and Jacob, appeared unto me, saying, I have surely visited you, and seen that which is done unto you in Egypt. And I have said, I will bring you up out of the affliction of Egypt unto the land of the Canaanites, and the Hittites, and the Amorites, and the Perizzites, and the Hivites, and the Jebusites, unto the land flowing with milk and honey. And they shall hearken to thy voice, and they shall come thou and the elders of Israel unto the king of Egypt, and ye shall say unto him, The Lord God of the Hebrews hath met with us, and now let us go, we beseech thee, 3 days' journey into the wilderness, that we may sacrifice to the Lord our God. And I am sure that the king of Egypt will not let you go, no, not by a mighty hand. And I will stretch out my hand and smite Egypt with all my wonders, which I will do in the midst thereof, and after that he will let you go. And I will give you this people favor in the sight of the Egyptians, and it shall come to pass, that when ye go, ye shall not go empty. But every woman shall borrow of her neighbor, and of her that sojourneth in her house, jewels of silver, jewels of gold and raiment. And ye shall put them upon your sons and upon your daughters, and ye shall spoil the Egyptians. So he runs right into the plan. Verses 16, 17, and 18. We see, first of all, that the instructions is God's message to Israel. Okay? Moses, verse 16, was to do what? Go back to Egypt and do what? Was his first job? Get who together? Get the elders together, right? Get all the elders together and tell them that God had appeared unto him. Explain to them who God is again by going through the introductions that God gave them. And call himself the God of your fathers, specifically Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It's important for the Hebrews to understand it. Okay? God, once Moses does that, he is then supposed to communicate to the elders and tell them that God has visited his people, has seen their afflictions, has seen what they're experiencing, and then to assure the elders that God is going to bring Israel out of this affliction and into the land that is flowing with milk and honey. Okay? The witness of God here is emphasized in verse 17. If you go back and look at verse 17 with me, please. And I've said, I'll bring you up out of the affliction unto the land of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, and the Perizzites, and unto the land of the Jebusites, unto a land filling with milk and honey. Verse 17, where's that at? Maybe verse 18. The witness here of God is to emphasize, it helps add more fuel here to the message of his people that they needed to hear. Okay? That he had already been there, he's already witnessed their affliction, already been in the midst of them in the presence, and would be with them to lead them to the promised land. Okay? We get to verse 18 in the first part of this. Why would Moses here have reason to doubt the elders of Israel would listen to him when he tells them about God's plan. So, and they shall hearken to thy voice, and they shall come, thou and the elders of Israel, unto the king of Egypt. Why would Moses have reason to believe they would not listen to him when he showed up?
Don't listen first, huh?
Exactly, right? 40 years ago, they didn't listen to the guy. And so he was probably thinking, you know, show back up, I'm a little different, I'm aged some. I walk in there and say, hey, I'm Moses. This is what we're doing. God told me this, that they may not believe, right? But God puts special emphasis here on verse 18. And they shall hearken to, what's he say? To my voice? But no, my voice. In God speaking, he says, they're going to listen to who? Your voice, right? Thy voice, Moses. He puts special emphasis on it there to let him know that Israel would indeed heed him because the I am is with him. Okay? But even with this special emphasis, Moses, of course, we're going to see later on, is going to question whether or not these people are going to actually listen to him. So that's God's message to Israel. The second part of verse 18, we see God's message to Pharaoh. And the initial message to Pharaoh here was brief. It was limited. Moses was to tell Pharaoh what? That the people of Israel need how many days? 3. They need 3 days to travel out to the wilderness to do what? To worship, right? To worship, to bear the witness, to worship God. This would have meant, essentially, that the building projects that the Israelites were doing for Pharaoh, this was going to have to remain idle for about a week. About a week long that Pharaoh would have to let them go. Now, God tells Moses that Pharaoh's going to say what? And how? Right? He tells him. Pharaoh's not going to agree. He goes in and says that. He's not going to allow these Hebrews who take a week's vacation to go out to the wilderness to worship. Okay? So that's what Moses is going to tell Pharaoh. God continues verse 19 with his message of deliverance. Okay? And if you look specifically at verse 19, what did God say would not compel Pharaoh to let Israel go? And I'm sure the king of Egypt will not let you go. No, not by what? A mighty hand. And the mighty hand reference is a reference to God's hand here. Okay? Soon, and he goes in verses 20, 21, 22, explaining what that mighty hand is. Okay? While Pharaoh's not going to let them go, God's mighty hand is going to come down onto Pharaoh and onto the Egyptians. And he's going to come down very mightily, right? With great, tremendous power. And with each blow from this mighty hand that God gives Pharaoh, Pharaoh would give in and say he would let God's people go, but then in each case, Pharaoh eventually responded by hardening his heart even more and more and more, as we're going to see as we get into chapter 4 a little bit later on, or 14 a little bit later on. Pharaoh would never make the permanent decision to let God's people go, right? God's blows on Egypt would eventually move Pharaoh enough to let the people get out of town. Verse 20 in chapter 3. And I will stretch out my hand and smite Egypt with all my wonders, which I will do in the midst thereof. And after that, he will let you go. We've been going over Revelation in the Sunday evening service. I've not been able to be here for that. Please go watch it on YouTube at least. But we see God's releasing of these woes and these wonders on the entire world. And the destruction and the power. This is the exact same type of power is being focused just on the Egyptians. Right? We see these plagues. And we see the stuff that God does. And he's focusing on just the Egyptians. You can imagine the absolute chaos. And as we get into these plagues a little bit later on. Just to be the Israelites and to see this happening. And God doing this on their behalf. Once they got into the wilderness, they should have never said, why did you take us out of here? Right? But of course we know that they do. We're going to see that mighty hand be placed on the Egyptians over and over and over here. Hardening Pharaoh's heart more and more. Eventually, though, he lets them get out of town. As a matter of fact, in verse 21 and 22, God kind of gives a promise that when the Israelites leave, that the Egyptians are going to be so happy to see them go, that what are they going to do in verse 21 and 22? Give them stuff, and not just some stuff, like the good stuff, right? Silver and gold, and put it on the kids, put it on the sons and the daughters, and I'm glad you're getting at it. So what's God going to essentially do as we finish up here? He's going to remove them from the slavery. He's going to increase their wealth, some estimates like tenfold, and get them headed to the land that He's promised. While it has been difficult on the Israelites for several decades now, God is continuing and will take care of them, and going to not just take care of them, but bless them richly. Now, we finished. Why should Moses now have complete confidence in God at this point after this conversation? Why should he have complete confidence after now God has told him or had this conversation with him?
It's pretty detailed.
Exactly, right? That's what I think is important here. Not only has God told Moses, hey, I am the I am. I'm going to be with you. He then goes into a bullet point PowerPoint, step by step by step by step, exactly what's going to happen. Okay, now, I know from teaching the kids that I teach, if I can lay out for them, because we're doing a lab, if I can lay out for them exactly, not give them any variables, this is what you're going to do, you're then going to do this, and this is going to happen. 99% of the time they can follow the instructions, right? And they get to the end that I want. And they don't have any concerns or questions because it's laid out for them exactly. Okay? And they can usually get it. Moses has just been laid out the plan perfectly. All he has to do is go to step A, to step B, to step C, and it's going to be finished up. So he should have complete and total confidence in God. The I am is going to be with him. He's going to help them lead the people out of Egypt into the promised land. And he's going to give them, he's already given them the exact way it's going to happen. That should have been all that Moses needed to know. Of course, we know, as we're going to get into next week, Moses is still not so sure. Let's pray. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for the lesson we have. Thank you for this example of the living God that we serve. Has the ability to do what you're doing here in Exodus. And the reason you're doing it is because of the concern for your people and the promise that you've given them. And it never ceases to just absolutely just blow my mind. That you're just as concerned for me as you were for Moses here. You're just as concerned for me as you were the people of Israel. And you've given me the exact same promise and never leave my side. So, the magnitude of your abilities and your power, you focused in on just little old us. Nothing, just a blip on time. And you're concerned for our souls. It's completely and utterly just humbling. And I pray that we are reminded, because we are that important to you, therefore you should be that important to us. All the time. Regardless of the plagues that are in front of us or the hills that may have to climb, the I am is with us. We can't be for that. I pray that you're a constant thought in our mind and our brain as well. I pray for Pastor Rob as well as he comes in the next hour. Just use him